Restart Episode 8. Did someone call for a side of goblins? Sir Kurt Almond rode beneath a sky torn open by wind and light, his golden armor blazing like a moving sun as the road vanished beneath pounding hooves. The air ripped past him in screaming currents, flattening his cloak and forcing each breath from his lungs in burning pulls. His horse answered every demand with brutal loyalty, barding flashing gold despite the sweat and dust streaking its powerful frame. Together they rode toward where the prince had asked them to join him once they completed negotiations, at a pace that felt less like riding and more like defiance. The land was heartbreakingly beautiful. Hills rolled in soft, endless green, grasses bending in silver waves beneath the wind. Rivers caught the sun and scattered it like molten glass, and distant trees stood tall and unafraid. Kurt felt a bitter twist in his chest at the sight. This was a land that had given him nothing but delay and frustration, yet now, faced with the threat of goblin raids, it suddenly demanded his protection. Unwanted memories clawed their way into his thoughts as the wind howled around him. Days wasted in stone halls and perfumed chambers, burdened with negotiations that had never mattered. He had ridden here escorting the prince, tasked with securing passage and favor in lands that had produced nothing of value, nothing of strategic worth, nothing that justified the effort. Noble Duke Gordon had seen to that personally. The man was an insufferable pompous ass, thick with titles and thin on sense, offering no concessions, no troops, no supplies, only demands, money, imperial privileges, empty smiles masking naked greed. Kurt's jaw tightened as the memory burned. All that time, all that patience, for nothing. Nothing, until fear finally crept through the countryside. It was not diplomacy that moved Gordon, nor duty, nor loyalty to empire or realm. It was panic. Rumors of goblins striking farms and roads spread faster than any herald, and suddenly the Duke's courage fled with his household. Gordon had abandoned his estate in haste, leaving gates barred and servants scrambling. And only then, had permission been granted. A letter, hastily sealed, promising a later meeting to set matters even once the danger had passed and the Duke felt safe again. Cowardice dressed as prudence. The thought sharpened Kurt's urgency until it bordered on fury. While nobles fled and delayed, the Dawn Guard stood fast. While the prince was in harm's way, he was fighting in words and wax seals. He leaned lower over his horse's neck, urging more speed from a body already near its limit, guilt and resolve twisting together in his chest. He glanced back once. Behind him, his companions rode in a tight, gleaming line, their armor and horse barding glowing gold in the sunlight like a living blade drawn across the land. Sir Vinland met his gaze, helm off, hair whipping wildly in the wind. The concern in his eyes mirrored Kurt's own, fear not for themselves, but for those waiting ahead. Vinland gave a single, firm nod, a silent vow carried between them without words. Kurt turned forward again, the wind stealing any chance of doubt. Negotiations, nobles, and hollow promises meant nothing now. Only distance remained, and the lives balanced upon it. With golden armor blazing and hooves thundering like war drums, Kurt rode on, determined that fear and delay would not be the legacy left to Valoria, or to his prince. The wind suddenly carried more than the scent of grass and pine. Movement cut across the road ahead. 4 goblins, squat and hunched, their gray-green skin filthy with travel and blood. They scrambled just onto the road in packs of two, crude blades and spears clutched loosely, not a warband, but something lesser. Scouts, perhaps, or survivors of a force already broken. Or worse. Loose things, emboldened enough to ravage the countryside alone. There was no time to slow. Kurt's expression did not change, but something ancient and heavy stirred within him. He had been born with a divine talent rare even among Valoria's non-heroes. Mastery over kinetic energy. Every impact, every force delivered or received could be seized, stored within his body like a coiled storm. He could release it to mend shattered flesh, reinforce failing muscle, or unleash it outward as ruin. It was a gift that marked him as chosen and burdened him with restraint. He reached back and drew his staff in one smooth motion. The weapon was unmistakable, a golden staff forged from Valoria's light-infused alloy, its surface alive with faint internal radiance. Runes etched so finely they seemed grown rather than carved. As his horse thundered forward at full gallop, Kurt shifted his weight with practiced precision, leaning far to the left side of the saddle, one knee locked, one hand tight on the reins. The first goblin barely had time to turn. Kurt swung. The staff struck the creature square in the face with catastrophic force. Bone collapsed inward, and the goblin's head snapped back as if erased, its body flung aside lifeless before it hit the ground. The second strike followed immediately. No pause, no wasted motion. The staff smashed into the next goblin's skull, tearing it free in a spray of green and yellow blood that spattered the road behind them. At the moment of each impact, crimson kinetic energy surged over Knight Almond's armor. It flowed visibly now, a pulsing red current rising from the point of contact, racing up the staff into Kurt's arm and through his body like molten veins of light. His armor caught the glow and reflected it in sharp flashes, gold and red entwined. He did not release it immediately. He held it, compressed, focused, while the horse carried him past the carnage without slowing. The remaining two goblins screamed and raised their weapons. Kurt straightened slightly in the saddle, planted the staff forward, and opened his grip, not his hand, but his control. The stored energy discharged. A rippling wave of kinetic force burst outward from the staff in a glow of red and gold, unmistakable in its effect. The air itself seemed to ripple as the energy rushed to meet the goblins. The two goblins were struck mid-motion and obliterated, their bodies torn apart and hurled in opposite directions, broken pieces scattering into the grass and against the rocks with wet, final sounds. The horse never broke stride. Behind him, cheers rang out, short, fierce, and victorious. Knights laughed and shouted as they surged past the broken goblin bodies. Sir Vinland did not shout. Instead, he drew. Vinland's longbow was a regal thing, tall and elegant, its limbs inlaid with gold filigree and tensioned with enchanted cord. In one smooth sequence, he knocked, drew, and released. The first golden arrow sang through the air and took a distant goblin clean through the head, dropping it where it stood. The second arrow followed a heartbeat later, punching through one goblin's torso and continuing on into another behind it, pinning both bodies to a tree trunk with brutal finality. They twitched for a moment, clawing weakly at the shaft, then went still. Vinland turned his head back toward the road and continued riding hard, his long blonde hair whipping in the air behind him. With a practiced motion, he lifted his longbow and slipped the cord over his head, settling the weapon so it rested across his back and against his shoulders. The familiar weight freed his hands and let him lean forward, urging his horse to greater speed. Two goblins with a single arrow, clean, efficient. He had believed the kill finished, and behind him, just another threat left bleeding in the dirt. But goblins were tricky, sneaky creatures, and they never made things easy. The realization crept in as he replayed the scene in his mind. One of them had hidden its tracks beneath another's, deliberately masking its presence. It was a clever trick, the sort meant to punish haste and reward patience. Vinland's jaw tightened as the road stretched ahead. He respected cunning, even when it came from something vile, but he would not underestimate it again. The road ahead lay empty once more. No one slowed, no one spoke. The cheers faded as quickly as they had come, swallowed by wind and speed. Hooves thundered on, armor gleamed, and the golden column of riders pressed forward with renewed urgency. For the rest of the ride, there were no more goblins, no cries, no clash of steel, only the relentless rush of air and the grim silence of men who knew that what they had just ended was merely a warning. As the road curved, the settlement finally revealed itself in the distance. The imperial road ran straight and unbroken to the front gate, a hard line of authority cutting through the land. The gate was braced with heavy wooden beams, iron bands, and layered defensive structures, faint wards glimmering along carved runes in stone and timber. It was a place built to endure a siege, and it welcomed them like a clenched fist finally opening. Sir Almond slowed only at the threshold. Recognition came instantly. Guards along the walls shouted his name, cheers spilling down from towers as the gates were thrown wide. Kurt rode through at the head of the Dawn Guard, then reined in just inside the perimeter. As he dismounted, he drew his golden staff from its mount in the same fluid motion, the light-infused alloy catching the firelight and sun alike. The staff rested easily in his hand, as natural to him as breath. He took the reins of his horse and walked forward, staff in one hand, cheers following him through the gate. Guards saluted as he passed, some striking shields, others calling out welcomes. Kurt answered with brief nods, fatigue etched plainly into his posture now that the ride was done. Vinland and the others dismounted and clanked arms against each other and handed off their horses, while clearing all gear of them and onto their shoulders. Squires carefully walked the beasts to the stables to be cared for and groomed. Kurt was directed to the Dawn Guard tent and opened the flap to see fellow Imperial Knights Sir Craig and Sir Sage having a debate about holy water and vampires. He smiled to himself as he walked inside, planting the staff lightly against the ground. Without preamble, he said, "Well, this is outrageous." Laughter broke out immediately. Sir Cale Ironward was the first to step forward, grinning as he dropped coins into Craig's open palm. Serene Vale followed, adding his share with a shake of his head and an amused snort. Sir Bruce came last, pressing the final pieces down with mock solemnity. 5 copper and 1 silver clinked together as they were counted out. "I told you he'd say it first thing," Sir Craig said, drawing more laughter. More of the Dawn Guard gathered in close, clapping Kurt on the shoulder, greeting him with relief and familiarity. Kurt shook his head and added, "Governor Gordon is an ass with a hat." That earned a louder roar of approval, even from nearby guards who were clearly listening. "If you took a stinky goblin ass and put a hat on it," Kurt continued dryly, tapping the staff once against the dirt, "that would be Governor Gordon." The camp erupted. Sir Sage laughed openly now, and Sir Craig lifted the coins in triumph. Kurt went on, the words spilling freely. The man far outreached his reason, demanding noble titles, special privileges, access to imperial matters. I was flabbergasted. 2 days of negotiating with a feeble-minded idiot, and this is who governs this providence. Groans and knowing laughter rippled through the group. In the end, I told him he would get all the glory, Kurt said. Every bit of it. That would be his reward, and no more. I left him sitting there with his mouth open. I made it clear that if he refused, the emperor would hear exactly how helpful his governor had been. His expression hardened, humor sharpening into steel. That's when he cowered. When I looked into his eyes, I saw no nobility at all. A brief, heavy silence followed. And when goblins were mentioned, Kurt finished, voice flat. The governor ran. Captain Lysandra Stormheart pushing away the tent flaps, radiant in golden armor, the sunlight rolling across her polished plates and highlighting her sandy blonde long hair, twin braids, as she stepped inside. Her twin golden axes were secured at her sides, perfectly balanced and unmistakably hers. She stepped forward with an open smile and clasped Almond's forearm in a firm, familiar warrior's grip. "Sir Almond," she said warmly, "welcome back. How did the negotiations fare?" Kurt barely drew breath before the Dawn Guard answered for him. Sir Ironward raised his chin in mock formality. "Governor Goblin Butte, esteemed and honorable virtue of Valoria, who no does not stink, nor is not a turd in any way, shape, nor form." Captain Lysandra smirked, shaking her head as she released Kurt's arm. "I see the talks were memorable." Kurt exhaled through his nose. "That's one way to describe surviving them. The talk around the land is that you all beat a major horde of angry goblins, fiercely independent chiefs and all," Kurt continued. He gestured with his staff. "I was able to kill a few stragglers as they made their way toward the outer cities." Sir Sage clapped emphatically. "Oh, good. You got a few after all," he said in a mocking tone. A small ripple of laughter followed. It lingered only a heartbeat longer. Lysandra's smile stayed in place, but her eyes sharpened as the words settled. Outer cities. Stragglers. A route long enough to matter. Long enough that riders should have been met. "How many times did the sentries cross your path on the way in?" she asked, the question light, almost conversational. "Not once," Kurt replied. The warmth drained from her face. She turned cleanly, already moving. "With me. Now." Lysandra exited the tent at a run, golden armor moving with practiced ease, axes steady at her sides. Kurt followed without hesitation, the Dawn Guard falling in behind them as they cut through the camp toward the southernmost gate. One of the raised sentry posts she herself had ordered built. Reinforced timber, stone base, clear sight lines over the open approaches. They reached it at speed. A single guard stood waiting, pale and rigid. The gates were closed. 2 more guards stood on the wall above, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Report!" Lysandra snapped. "No check-ins," the guard said. "It's been 30 minutes since the last scheduled return. Last full patrol was nearly an hour ago. No one's come back." Lysandra's hand went to one of her axes. "Battle formation. Full perimeter. Now." She met the guard's eyes and repeated it. Louder. Her voice carried like steel. The camp exploded into motion. Shields rose. Lines formed. Towers were manned. Orders echoed across the walls as discipline replaced humor in an instant. In the distance, a golden horse ran toward their location, its rider leaning backwards as the horse galloped to the wall and patiently waited. The knight stationed closest to the wall gasped, "He's missing his head!" Then the bell rang. Once. Twice. Its iron voice rolled out across the settlement and into the dark beyond the gates, warning all who heard it that the dawn guard was awake. And whatever had silenced the sentries was already too close for comfort. The full horror of the assault became clear as the enemy revealed its true intent. They were already at the rear. To raise their fortifications, the Golden Conclave had driven the forest back, cutting down trees for thousands of feet until a broad clearing encircled their walls. It was not a boundary made for comfort or pride, but one born of caution from a time when the woods beyond had given reason to fear what moved within. At its far edge, where the axes had finally stopped and the tree line still stood, something began to move. The forest there formed a dense, unbroken barrier. Trunks pressed close, branches knotted together, shadows sealed beneath the canopy. From that dark line, shapes drifted forward as if the woods itself were releasing them. Shadows stretched and thickened, peeling away to reveal nightmares that had stepped from old fables into flesh. Goblins emerged, thick-bodied and massive, each one as large as two common goblins crushed together into a single brutal frame. Many rode enormous hyenas, warped by foul breeding and darker forces. Their spines bowed unnaturally, ribs shifting beneath mottled hides, jaws gaping too wide as strings of saliva stretched and snapped. The hyenas crept forward, snapping and snarling at one another, biting at faces and necks with casual cruelty. Teeth clashed. Blood darkened fur. Their laughter was wrong, broken, choking howls layered with the wet sounds of tearing flesh. The noise rose and fell in uneven waves, a chorus of hunger and madness that pressed against the mind, gnawing at courage until fear felt inevitable. Behind them thundered orcs, large, angry, and relentless, clad in salvaged, uneven armor and wielding brutal weapons meant to crush shields apart. Among them moved orc majors and large wild bears with small saddles ridden by small green goblins. These large bears were towering brutes with brown, dirty, matted fur, their bodies swollen with unnatural strength. A massive orc emerged from the tree line, towering head and shoulders above the undergrowth, its bulk forcing branches aside as if they had the courtesy to move. Its skin was the color of cured leather, stretched tight over a frame built for breaking, thick cords of muscle shifting beneath the surface with every step. Each footfall sank into the earth, compressing leaves into the soil with a wet, final sound. It wore mismatched armor scavenged from fallen foes, dented plates, cracked mail, straps pulled taut where they were never meant to fit. Nothing aligned properly, yet the armor held, beaten into place by hands strong enough to make metal obey. Scratches and gouges told stories the orc clearly didn't bother to remember. In its right hand hung a grotesque blade, nearly as tall as a man. It looked as though two field scythes had been fused together by a careless smith or a furious one. The metal warped, edges jagged and uneven, the weight of it dragging shallow furrows through the dirt when it shifted. The orc carried it easily, loosely, like a thing that barely deserved attention. When it stopped, the forest seemed to shrink around it. The blade dripped with bright red blood. The orc threw back its head and screamed an unholy yell, the sound rolling across the open ground and slamming into the rear walls. Then it hurled something into the cleared trees. A human head rolled into view. Silence followed. Smaller goblins at the front of the rear assault dragged two figures forward, hands bound tight with rope, and shoved them into the open. Imperial scouts. Knights in lighter armor, battered, bloodied, their tabards torn but still visible in the sunlight. Their hands were cut free. For a single breath, nothing happened. Then the goblins pushed them forward and released them. The scouts ran. A shriek of laughter rose from the goblin ranks as crossbows snapped up. Arrows screamed through the air, black shafts hunting golden backs as the knights fled across the open ground. The goblins meant to kill them for sport. Kurt's hands curled into fists so tight the leather of his gloves creaked. Heat climbed his spine, sharp and immediate, the kind that made the world narrow and precise. They're toying with them, like animals. His jaw locked as another volley flew. Imperial knights were not frightened children. The two scouts ran together, one slightly ahead, the other turning just enough to raise a magic shield. They began to alternate their running pattern, right, left, in unison. Pale light flared as the barrier snapped into existence. Arrows struck and shattered against it. Splintered wood rang as shafts deflected or burst apart. One stumbled as he ran, his foot falling into a small hole. The other hauled him upright without slowing. Kurt felt something dangerous settle into place behind his eyes. Still thinking, still adapting. Pride flickered through the fury, brief and sharp. Good. Don't die like this. At the wall, Captain Lysandra Stormheart did not look away. She watched Kurt as much as she watched the field. She saw the way his shoulders squared, the way his weight shifted forward, the way his fists never unclenched. She knew that look. Paraxis was not here to anchor him with draconic certainty. High Prince Almond was not here to temper impulse with command. And Kurt Almond had never been a man who waited when he believed he could act. She opened her mouth to speak, and did not yet. On the field below, the largest orc let out a low growl and motioned forward. 3 goblin hyenas snapped and bit at one another until their riders leapt into the saddles, jerking the reins hard. The crazed beasts surged forward, mouths frothing, speed eating up distance with terrifying ease. The scouts looked back once. They looked at each other. Then they kept running. Kurt let the world slow to a crawl. Sunlight reflected in his eyes as he stepped down from the wall, studying the open ground beyond the rear gate. Enemy movement, distance, speed. The tightening arc of goblins and orcs, angles, timing, cost. One could almost see the calculations forming, ideas assembling with dangerous speed. I can reach them. I can break that line. I don't need permission. The thought settled, reckless and brilliant, and Kurt smiled without humor as the ground below rushed closer. Sir Kurt Almond let what he witnessed slow to a crawl in his mind. The screams, the thunder of boots, the snap of bowstrings, everything stretched and separated, each detail isolated and weighed. Distance, speed, timing, this was not chaos. It only looked like it. Beneath it lay patterns, and patterns could be broken. This was the moment that demanded clarity. Not hesitation, not permission. Just understanding, clean and exact, focused entirely on the reckless brilliance that had always defined him. Kurt had never been a man who enjoyed being told what to do. He stepped down from the wall, one measured stride at a time, eyes never leaving the open ground beyond the rear gate. Sunlight flashed across his gaze as he tracked enemy movement. The fleeing scouts, the tightening arc of goblins and orcs closing like a blade. The scouts were slowing. One injured. The goblin riders were faster. Too fast. They'll be overtaken in seconds. Distances aligned in his mind. The gap from wall to clearing, the angle of approach, the reach of his own power if he committed fully. He counted without numbers, felt the spacing rather than measured it. If he waited, they died. If he misjudged, he dismissed the thought. Ideas assembled with dangerous speed, each daring the next to be ignored. Forward momentum, vertical force. One impact, not many. He didn't need to kill the horde. He only needed to stop it, then. Clap. The sound was sharp, deliberate, a marker in his mind as much as in the air. Kurt stepped forward and drew a line in the dirt with his staff. Take off. He took 15 controlled steps back and carved a second line. Anchor. Standing at it, he lifted the staff horizontally between his forearms and clapped again, steady as a heartbeat. A red light pulsed from his hands, surged up to his head, flowed down to his toes, and returned to his palms. Power gathered, not wild, but coiled, compressed by intent. Clap. The sound deepened, heavier now, echoing against stone and steel. The light beat in time with his hands, spreading from his palms and crawling up his arms. He felt the ground respond, felt the tension building beneath his boots. Clap. The air thickened, pushing outward as the red glow wrapped his entire body. Stones beneath him began to vibrate. Dust lifted in trembling rings. Enough. Any more and I lose control. Kurt stepped forward. He bent, coiled, and leapt, his body twisting midair as he drew the staff upward and slammed it into the ground at the precise angle he had chosen. The pulsing red energy surged from his body into the staff and vanished into the earth. The response was immediate. A concussive burst of force detonated beneath him, launching him 35 feet straight up and hurling him beyond the protective walls. He cleared them in a blaze of golden light, trajectory clean, arc perfect. For a single heartbeat he hung there, cloak snapping violently, staff raised high against the burning sky. Right on time. From the battlements, Captain Lysandra Stormheart screamed at the top of her lungs, "You crazy idiot!" Then Kurt came down like judgment itself. He crashed into the clearing just ahead of the fleeing scouts and the oncoming horde, the staff striking first as the ground buckled beneath the impact. Dust, stone, and broken earth exploded outward as he landed, a living barrier forged of force and intent. For a breath, the battlefield went still. Sir Sage stared, awe plain on his face as he lightly tapped Carl Ironwood's shoulder. "So," he said faintly, "are we flying now?" The battle should have collapsed into chaos, but instead it seemed to orbit a single unmoving point. Behind him, the Dawn Guard surged toward the rear gate, shields locking, blades drawn, ready to meet the orcs head-on. They moved not out of fear but momentum, galvanized by the impossible sight of a single knight who had turned gravity itself into a weapon. At the center of it all, Kurt straightened, staff in hand, utterly unconcerned with the chaos he had just unleashed. "Hold!" Captain Lysandra Stormheart shouted from the battlements, her voice cutting cleanly through the roar of battle. "This gate will not be opened. Climb down the walls, controlled descent, shields first." A groan rolled through the Dawn Guard as one. Discipline won out. They broke off their charge and sprinted back toward the stairwells, boots pounding as they raced to redeploy along the walls. Out on the field, the enemy did not wait. 3 goblins pressed forward atop massive mutated hyenas, the beasts' muscles rippling unnaturally beneath patchy, scarred fur. Axes were raised. One goblin leaned low in his saddle and hurled his spear with a shrill cry, the weapon spinning end over end straight toward Sir Kurt's chest. Sir Kurt did not turn. He shifted his stance and let the spear pass, the iron head whispering by his shoulder before burying itself deep in the churned earth behind him, the shaft quivering where it stood. In the same breath, arrows followed. The two Imperial scouts burst past Sir Kurt, breath ragged as they fled toward the safety of the walls. Sir Kurt lifted his staff and batted the arrows aside, each deflection sharp and effortless, iron ringing as shafts shattered or spun away. The scouts ran on, untouched. The hyenas closed the distance in a thunder of claws and snapping jaws. Another spear flashed forward. Sir Kurt ducked smoothly, the weapon hissing over his shoulder, and impaled itself into the freshly disturbed ground. Kurt smiled as he spoke his thoughts. "Ready for the show?" he said, as he twisted his hips in one fluid motion. His staff came around in a wide, devastating arc, like striking a wooden ball across the high fields of Solanor. The impact was tremendous. When staff met flesh and bone, a violent flare of red energy erupted at the point of contact, rippling outward in a shock of heat and light. The hyena and its rider were torn from the ground and hurled skyward, bodies spinning end over end as if flung by a god's hand, vanishing beyond the battlefield and into the tree line. The red energy did not dissipate from the powerful impact. It surged back along the length of the staff in pulsing veins of light, flooding over Sir Kurt's gauntlets and pouring into his clenched hands. For a heartbeat, the glow crawled up his arms and sank into his chest, drawn inward as if by gravity. His breath caught once, then steadied. The remaining two hyenas skidded to an abrupt halt, claws tearing up dirt as they balked mid-charge. Along the walls, Dawn Guard soldiers stared, awe stealing their breath. It felt less like fighting beside a knight and more like standing near a living legend. Both sides stood frozen, shock rippling through the clearing at what they had just witnessed. The moment hung heavy, unreal, as if the battlefield itself needed time to understand what had changed. Then Kurt let out a loud, sharp whistle. The sound sliced through the silence, casual, confident, almost insulting in its ease. He raised one hand and rolled his wrist in a slow, deliberate motion, fingers curling inward as he beckoned them forward. "Come on," the gesture said. "You wanted this." A crooked grin tugged at his mouth as his eyes stayed locked on the enemy line. "It's about time," he called out, voice steady and amused, "for you to start worrying." The motion did more damage than the words. Across the field, hesitation crept in. Feet shifted, grips tightened, jaws clenched. What had once been certainty now wavered. Kurt wasn't bracing for the next blow. He was inviting it. And that realization unsettled them far more than any weapon ever could. One hyena lunged anyway, its rider raising his axe with a guttural cry. Sir Kurt stepped inside the attack and drove his staff straight upward. The blow lifted the beast's skull before slamming it down into the earth. Bone cracked. The ground split. The hyena went still instantly. Its rider fumbled. The axe slipped, struck Kurt's boot, and bounced. Without looking down, he hooked the weapon upward with his foot, flicked it into the air, caught it mid-spin, and hurled it. The axe struck the last hyena squarely. Beast and rider collapsed together in a tangle of limbs and iron, skidding across the dirt to a stop. Before Sir Kurt needed to move again, the two scouts returned. They came in hard from opposite sides. One veered past Sir Kurt's shoulder and tore the goblin spear from where it still stood embedded in the ground, the very weapon that had been thrown moments earlier. The shaft came free with a wet sound as he leveled it without breaking stride. He drove the spear forward with both hands, impaling one of the goblins tangled among the dead mounts. The second scout carried nothing but a jagged stone clenched white-knuckled in his gauntlet. He seized his target by the collar and froze, 2 front teeth missing. Recognition flared hot and sharp. "This is for Flidora, my steed," he roared as he slammed the rock down. "She was like one of our own." The goblin's head snapped sideways under the blow. "You killed her!" the scout snarled, striking again. "You, missing-toothed bastard! I saw you do it!" He hit him again and again. The body went limp, but the scout struck once more before finally stopping, breath tearing from his chest, arm shaking with spent fury. Silence rushed in around them. The rock slipped from his fingers and struck the dirt with a dull, final sound. Sir Kurt finally turned. It was over in seconds as they each looked at each other. The red glow beneath his armor dimmed, banked deep within him, held in reserve. For a brief, surreal moment, all three laughed. Short, disbelieving bursts at the suddenness of it all, at how quickly death had come and gone. Kurt looked at them with open approval. Other men might have fled. These two had turned back unarmed, charging into danger to aid a fellow knight. That mattered. "Thank you for the save," said one scout, as the other nodded in agreement. "Let's get us back to safety, okay?" finished Kurt, as they all nodded in agreement. Arrows began to fall again, and the three of them backtracked toward the gate, moving together, dodging shafts as they went, shields and staff flashing in practiced rhythm. Across the field, the large commander orc watched eyes in a mix of disbelief and hate. Its rage was unmistakable. This moment had been meant to instill fear, to break morale, to show the cost of resistance. Instead, it had only made the Imperial Knights bolder. And that realization burned hotter than any spell. "How is this happening?" it hissed under its horrible breath. "Humans don't fight like this!" Arrows chased them the entire distance, thudding into the ground, skidding off magic shields, and bursting against hastily raised wards. At the rear of the retreat, Kurt moved with them, not running so much as advancing backward, staff a constant blur. Shafts meant for fleeing knights were batted aside mid-flight, shattered, or knocked harmlessly into the dirt with sharp, ringing cracks. Breath burned, armor rang, the air screamed with passing missiles. Kurt stepped into every opening, placing himself between arrow and scout, turning lethal volleys into showers of splinters. When too many came at once, his staff flashed wide, red light flaring briefly as arrows veered off course or lost all force before reaching their targets. They crossed the final stretch together. Hands slammed against stone as the scouts reached the walls of the camp, boots skidding on gravel and blood-slick earth. Kurt was the last through, spinning once more to knock aside a final arrow before stepping cleanly behind the line of wards. Then, laughter. Raw, breathless, disbelieving laughter echoed along the wall. Somehow, they were alive. The two scouts and Sir Almond turned as one, screaming at the top of their lungs, hurling wild gestures and shouted insults back at the enemy ranks below. The scouts' armor dented and scorched, lungs burning, they laughed again, the sound sharp with adrenaline and triumph. Nearly 50 goblin wizards forced their way forward through the press of bodies, They did not push past their kin. They went through them. Clawed hands tore down lesser goblins who lacked the marks of magic, dragging them underfoot as the line advanced. None who fell beneath the wizard's grasp rose again. Goblins died screaming, crushed and disemboweled in the mud, their deaths measured and necessary. These were not mistakes of battle. They were payment. The casters slowed only long enough to finish the work. As each non-mage collapsed, dark magic was driven into the dying body, binding flesh and soul before either could escape. The fallen shuddered once, then tore free of the ground, lifted by a sickly green glow that leaked from their mouths and eyes. Their spirits did not pass on. They were hooked, snarled, and dragged screaming into the spell. The wizard's chant was low and brutal, more like a gnawing growl than words. At its peak, the suspended bodies ruptured, bone cracked apart into floating fragments, flesh peeled into ribbons of light, and the trapped souls were crushed down into raw, volatile energy. What remained of the goblins was neither corpse nor spirit, but a churning mass of malignant power that hovered above the advancing line, thick and restless, waiting to be spent. The wizards spread out across broken stone and churned earth, forming a jagged, uneven front. Their tan skin was carved and scarred, runes cut deep and wide, layered over older marks where flesh had healed badly or not at all. Some sigils bore the distortion of teeth. Bite marks worked permanently into scar tissue. Goblin magic was not studied. It was consumed. The weak were slaughtered, and what survived was claimed. Their eyes burned with a hunger devoid of fury or mercy. Twisted staffs and crooked rods rose, slick with stains that could not be scrubbed away. As they drew in the gathered power, the air warped toward them, dragged inward like prey caught in a closing snare. Breath grew heavy. The ground trembled, responding to a magic that recognized dominance rather than balance. They did not beg the power to come. They did not bargain for it. They harvested it. As the last stolen soul was crushed into the spell, the gathered energy sank into the wizard's flesh, carving fresh runes as it burned through muscle and bone. The line stood ready, swollen with stolen strength, built upon the bodies of their own kind. What followed would be paid for in blood already spent. Each wizard had fed well, on rivals, on failures, on kin who had not been strong enough to matter. What remained was power stripped of restraint, dense and brutal, pressed into shape by nothing but survival. Armies feared them. Cities burned because of them. The Golden Conclave merely watched. A roar of fury tore through the enemy ranks as the casting locked into place. The scouts' return, unharmed, had never been part of the plan. From the rear battlements, Captain Stormheart's voice cut through the swelling pressure, steady and precise. "The Golden Conclave crossed the border prepared to protect a mobile camp," she called. "We brought wards designed to withstand years of sustained magical bombardment." Her gaze shifted briefly toward the village beyond the walls. We did not know New Beginnings existed. When it was found, those protections were relayed, redirected and anchored to the village itself. There was no hesitation in her tone. The village is fully warded, layered, reinforced, and sealed. It will hold. She turned back to the field, to the thinning lattice of power stretched wide around the camp. To do that, the camp wards were spread, not removed, diluted, enough to warn them, enough to slow an assault, not enough to absorb a focused strike indefinitely. The pressure deepened. Enemy magic pressed hard, feral and hungry, against defenses never meant to stand alone. The prince's voice was clear in her memory. It was a deliberate redistribution of strength. One we chose. Strength divided was still strength, when it was placed with purpose. The camp existed to draw the blow. The village existed to endure it. The air thickened. Clouds twisted into tight, grinding spirals overhead, lightning crawling through them in slow, deliberate veins. The sky darkened as if something vast had passed before the sun, and then the storm broke. Lightning fell first. It struck not the gate, but the space before it, and stopped. 30 feet out, the wards bloomed into being, translucent planes of sigilled light curving outward like invisible domes. The lightning hit and spread, flattening against the barrier in blinding sheets before crawling sideways, branching and skittering across the curved surface. Bolts as thick as siege cables slammed down in repeated strikes, each one carrying the weight of a falling tower. The thunder came a heartbeat later, a crushing wall of sound that rolled outward and away, leaving the space behind the wards unnaturally still. Then the fireballs arrived. Each one was the size of a wagon, vast spheres of churning flame and molten light hurled forward with the force of siege engines. They slammed into the wards and burst outward, not forward, flowering across the barrier in massive incandescent shells. Fire wrapped the curve of the magic, ballooned, and collapsed back on itself, spilling burning fragments and shock waves away from the gate. Some burned white-hot at their cores. Others roared with layered colors of alchemical flame, each detonation filling the air with concussion and glare. Heat rippled across the wards like water struck by stone, but behind them the air remained clear, untouched. Stone beyond the barrier blackened and flowed, then hardened again. Sections of earth were ripped free entirely, lifted in burning waves and hurled backward as if struck by invisible giants. Dirt and shattered rock scattered across the field, raining ash, glass, and molten slag. None of it crossed the line. Fire and lightning the size of siege weapons detonated across the wards before him, reflected in his golden armor as slow, regal waves of light. He stood straight and unyielding, helm bare, posture immaculate, gaze fixed forward as if the cataclysm before him were no more than ceremony. Lightning crawled along the wards and bent inward, tracing the edges of his silhouette before grounding harmlessly at his feet. With every impact, his armor flared brighter, red light pulsing beneath the gold like a steady heartbeat. Beside him, the scouts raised their shields and turned their faces away, forearms braced as wagon-sized fireballs and crushing bolts of lightning exploded only feet from them. Light hammered against their vision in violent flashes, too bright and too vast to watch directly, the concussive force rattling armor and teeth alike, yet no heat reached them, no force pressed through. The wards screamed as they absorbed the assault. Cracks raced across their surfaces, sealing in flashes of blinding brilliance. Each fracture fed the light, thickening the barrier, sharpening its curve as ever greater force was poured into it. Still, the barriers held. The darkening sky made many wince as thunder cracked and lightning split the air, each blinding impact detonating against the shields in sheets of searing light. The force of it rolled outward in concussive waves, rattling armor and stone alike. Kurt did not move or flinch. Lightning flashed brilliantly as it struck the wards before him, crawling and bursting across their surface, close enough to paint his armor in white fire. He stood unmoved, gaze steady, posture unbroken, as if the storm itself answered to his presence. A quiet, measured pride settled within him. The scouts were safe, pulled back from the killing ground, held beyond the reach of the goblins' fury. For the moment, they stood shielded and alive. Now, with the storm spent against his defenses and the enemy revealed in their full violence, Sir Kurt Almond stood ready. The enemy would pay for every step that followed.